Hello, I am Dr. Geoffrey Kiorpes. I am co-founder, arts director, and piano teacher at New York City Charter School of the Arts. Welcome to my From the Artist Bench presentation. For context, about 10 years ago, due to a number of factors, I had all but quit practicing and performing professionally. I got enough satisfaction playing my students' works and the occasional gig to keep me engaged. But all that changed about 5 years ago. I read a book by Joseph Horowitz called Dvorak's Prophecy and the Vexed Fate of Black Classical Music. I was intrigued and enlightened throughout the book. Towards the end, there were a number of chapters rediscovering a handful of Black composers, one of which was called Rediscovering Nathaniel Dett. Embarrassingly, at that time, I knew very little about Nathaniel Dett. But something in those pages made me get up and go over to the computer and download the first piece I could find, which was called Cinnamon Grove, a piano suite. I read through the first movement and found it quite beautiful. And then I got to the second movement. I made it for about 16 bars when I really knew that everything was about to change for me. I was completely blindsided by its haunting beauty. I knew that I was going to start practicing again, researching Black composers, and give recitals, and maybe even try to record an album. In the last 5 years, all of these things have come to fruition beyond my expectations. I even released my second album a couple weeks ago, which contains Cinnamon Grove. Nathaniel Dett's accomplishments are vast. To name a few, he was the first Black graduate of Oberlin College, the first to receive a master's from the Eastman School of Music, and the first Black director of music at the Hampton Institute. He presented the prestigious Hampton Singers at the White House, Carnegie Hall, and a major European tour of 7 countries. His oratorio, The Ordering of Moses, was one of the first major works of a Black classical composer to be broadcast nationally on NBC radio. I was blessed in 2022 to hear a Juneteenth performance of The Ordering of Moses at Riverside Church here in New York City. Dett preserved and published collections of Negro spirituals. He served as president of the National Association of Negro Musicians, and he won the Bowdoin Prize at Harvard for his essay, The Emancipation of Negro Music. Before I begin my analysis, I would like to share a performance of this Adagio Cantabile that I gave at Lane College in Jackson, Tennessee last year. It was my honor to give a recital of Dett's work at Lane, where Dett was in residence from 1908 to 1911, directly following his graduation from Oberlin. In my analysis, I'm going to share some strategies for navigating the tricky distances that are required from both hands, giving suggestions on how best to roll or arpeggiate the chords where appropriate. I'm going to share my ideas about voicing in this type of part writing, give some observations about the overall form, and finally some thoughts on the tempo. The Adagio Cantabile was composed on lines from Rabindranath Tagore. When thou commandest me to sing, it seems my heart would break with pride, and I look to thy face, and tears come to my eyes. When I was a young kid, I often tossed off slow movements in my practicing and just assumed they were really not all that hard. That they are often the most difficult to execute satisfactorily became painfully obvious as I got older, but I'm aware in my teaching that this is not always the case with younger students. This slow movement in particular provides some technical challenges, most notably with reaching large intervals and where you can't, deciding how best to break or roll or arpeggiate them where appropriate. The first such instance occurs right off the bat in measure 3. While we're in the key of D flat major, we start off on the 6th chord, in this case B flat minor, and reach the D flat in measure 3 through a descending bass line. I must have spent hours trying to make this part come off beautifully, but it was so difficult because I cannot reach the F to the A flat in the right hand. To break it into a roll just killed the simplicity of this opening melody, in my opinion. Then becomes which is a lot. No matter how many times I practiced it, it just did not sound satisfactory to me. Also, to let go of the low D flat in measure 4 and take the F with my left hand just destroyed the rich bass, right where it informs the harmonic focal point of the movement. I probably performed this piece 3 times and was still so bothered by it, I looked at it with fresh eyes, which in itself is a useful skill. Never give up the quest for a better solution. So I was staring at it, and it occurred to me that the first sounding of that low D flat in measure 3 is its first sounding. What if I caught it with the sostenuto pedal before I began, and then started the piece? So I tried pressing it, returning my hands to my lap, and then started. I was able to take that pesky F with my left hand, now I have a simple unbroken melody and a rich D flat in the bass. I have used this method ever since. I realize this solution might be a bit unconventional, but it is always my goal to execute the beauty of the music to the best of my ability, using all the resources available to me. The next spot occurs in measures 15 and 16. Measure 16 is notable, not only for the large stretch, again in the right hand, but also for 2 structural reasons. It is the first of many deceptive cadences that strongly suggest the jazz idiom, and it is the only spot in the entire movement where there is a rest in both hands at the same time, in this case, a quarter rest. While it would be nice to hold the E flat at the top of my right hand in the melody, it is not possible for me. But to release it does not cause the same problems as the low D flat at the beginning, as it's in a different register, and you can barely notice its absence on the resolution. I do find it important to observe the quarter rest. It separates the first 16 measures and highlights them as the core of the movement, which are the most profound in my opinion. Measures 21 through 24 provide another example of having to navigate an extreme jump, as well as connecting melody notes in the right hand without an audible break. And finally, using the pedal artfully to sustain the bass. I find it probable that Dett meant to jump the bass, as the right hand does not have a similar roll. And just rolling those 2 notes strikes me as very odd. So I just jump the bass like so. At the peak of the phrase, I want to ensure that I connect the E flat to the F in the right hand melody. Because of the wide intervals required in both hands, it is physically impossible. The only way to connect the melody note of the E flat to the F is to hold it and pedal it into the next chord. In some spots, this would be unacceptable because it would be too blurry. But in this range of the piano, it does not cause too much dissonance on the D-flat chord and is a much better solution than hearing an audible break before the final note. Finally, for this section, it is important to sustain the low D-flat in the bass. Holding the pedal down for all 5 beats as implied in the music gets a little blurry for my taste. So I experiment with slowly releasing the pedal over the 5 beats, which gives a really magical quality to this section, especially as it precedes the color change on the downbeat of the following measure. Slowly releasing the pedal would sound like this. Versus holding it or half pedaling. A spot like this requires that you test it on all pianos that you plan to perform it on, because obviously sustain, sostenuto, and soft pedals do not have a universal effect, sadly. The last spot I'll mention technically, I'm also going to come back to structurally in just a moment. It occurs at measure 38, where the theme reoccurs. We have another rolled chord in the right hand where I find more success taking the middle C with my left hand so that I can connect the E flat to the F as on page 1, like this. Lastly, I rearrange the hands as drawn on the page to take the alto and tenor duet with my left hand so that I can keep that nice legato melody on the top. The next subject I'd like to talk about is the overall form. When I first heard this movement, it really came across like a stream of consciousness, but upon further evaluation, I discovered its recurring material. The music is basically set up in 16-bar groups of 8 plus 8, which break down into 4 plus 4, with some exceptions. The first 8 will return a little over halfway through, but weakened harmonically. So while the opening harmonized each melody note, the recap is over a dominant pedal to start. The recap then explores a more exotic chromatic sequence. Instead of cadencing on the F minor 7 and keeping the melody stable, the melody now ends on an A natural, which leaves the listener hanging. In measure 25, a second theme occurs. The second statement of this second theme happens in measure 33 and precedes the recap. The final statement of this second theme comes in measure 45, directly following the recap. So the recap revisits the initial theme of the piece, sandwiched between 2 quotes of the secondary theme. This leads to one of the more unexpected chords in the movement in measure 51, which in jazz would be called a tritone substitution, or substituting the flat 2 chord for the dominant, in this case an E double flat 9 sharp 11. The jazzy exploration continues for this unexpected sequence of chords. Lastly, in measure 57, there is an allusion to the main theme in the bass, followed by a variation of the main theme to close. The harmonic deceptions are placed at the end of phrases, such as measure 15 and 16, which I spoke of earlier. This chord is a tritone substitution for the secondary dominant and resembles an augmented 6th chord in the way that it leads to the dominant. Measures 27 and 28 and measure 44 are examples of these deceptive cadences. The 6 or so measures I spoke of at measure 51, to me, come across as a recap, sort of culmination in this jazzy exploration. Dett was famously opposed to popular genres such as ragtime, jazz, and the blues. He felt they degraded the dignity of black music and reinforced racial stereotypes. He preferred classical fusion, combining folk elements with traditional Western forms. But here he seems perfectly comfortable in the idiom. I would like to touch briefly on my method for analyzing voicing, which is particularly important in a movement like this. It has a very hymn-like quality to it and comes across as 4-part writing: soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, although Dett does flesh that out in places with octaves and a few missing chord tones. I think of it as alto 1 and alto 2, tenor 1 and tenor 2. I've encouraged my students in the past, particularly with fugues, to go through with highlighters and highlight the different soprano, alto, tenor, and bass lines. I find having a visual understanding of these melodies and alternate melodic lines can really help when deciding which voices to bring out and which ones to maybe keep on a little more suppressed. So here are the first 8 bars with the melody outlined. Now we have the alto highlighted as well. I then do the same with the tenor and the bass. So let's start with the alto line, as voicing the melody is more obvious. First I play it by itself. I then play it with the other voices, but still emphasize the alto part. As you can hear, this is quite a beautiful line and could easily compete with the melody, so careful balancing is required. Let's hear the tenor voice in a similar fashion. And with the others. When deciding to bring out a particular voice, I often think of what one of my many illustrious teachers, Ruth Laredo, used to tell me, which was the rule of the first note. Meaning, when you're bringing out an alternate melodic line, it is very important that our ear is able to discern that first note. As an example, the middle C that precedes bar 9 is one where I apply the rule of the first note, so that I'm really listening to that alto line in the second 8 bars, as well as the melody. That the melody has more sustained notes versus the alto's moving line lends itself well to this type of voicing, as listeners can easily discern both voices. Lastly, just some thoughts on the tempo, Adagio Cantabile. I definitely feel like I hear it a little bit quicker than maybe what some feel is a traditional adagio. The cantabile part, to me, like these lines really need to sing, and I myself love to sing, and I gotta breathe, I gotta move things along. But I find it hard to sustain some of these melodic lines if the tempo is too slow. So I myself hear it a little bit more as probably an adagietto or an andantino. It's also crucial to know what spaces you're going to perform something in, as acoustics have a lot to do with deciding on the perfect tempo for the perfect performance. Thank you for watching and listening today. I hope you'll consider adding some Nathaniel Dett to your repertoire.